Joining us now is Ryan Riley. He's the senior justice reporter at the Huffington Post, who's been watching January 6th riot cases like a hawk. There's probably been no incident in recent history where there's been so much video from so many angles and so many corroborating witnesses and people admitting and posting on social media themselves that they were there and taking pride in it. Why are there not way more convictions and guilty pleas at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is bureaucracy. I mean, look at the extent of this investigation. Just try to imagine an inbox full of 200,000 tips. Right. That's a lot of tips. That's how many more than what the FBI has received up until this point. And trying to organize that and sort it is very difficult for an organization that in a lot of ways is pretty old school. You know, at the FBI, there's a real resistance to putting things down in writing. There's a heavy reliance on email. So when there's this system that doesn't necessarily, isn't up to speed and takes a little bit of a while to catch up to cases, it's really causing a lot of a backlog here. And some of these sedition hunters now have their own individual relationships with FBI agents, but others are just sort of dumping this into this sort of black hole when they send something to the FBI and don't know exactly where that tip goes. So the Sam Lazar case that's been, identified and out there for a while now, finally now the FBI does something about it. But him sitting out there for a very long time is something that's going to be difficult for the FBI to explain. I think it might be something also that this commission is interested in as well.
So there are a lot of people being charged. There are virtually no people who have been identified who are being let off the hook. But the gravity of these charges is different. You may be of the mind that all of them should be charged because they were all doing something wrong, but some of them are being charged with relatively minor charges. They're not generally being let off the hook, but they're being charged with minor things. There's a lot more energy going into the more serious stuff.
That's right. And I mean, those charges that a lot of the misdemeanor charges that most of the defendants are facing are the sort of thing that you would face if you went up to the Capitol, properly went through security and interrupted a congressional hearing. It's the same type of charge. So there's a little bit of pushback from some people in the community who said that this is a much different event than, a Code Pink protester who holds up a sign during an unfolding congressional hearing. But, that's basically with a charge that prosecutors have at hand. And you don't want to overreach, of course, because, that's something that already Republicans and we see some of the defense attorneys are accusing the government of doing, even though if you compare this to a lot of recent cases that the Justice Department has handled, they're actually going a little bit more lax than they were against, say, anti-Trump protesters back in during Trump's first inauguration. So I think that's something that, the Justice Department keeps in mind, because if they do overreach and they do overcharge someone, that's going to have tremendous consequences, not only in the judicial system, but also in the legislative system, because that's where we're going to see a lot of this political pushback if there is overcharging on by the Justice Department.
Officer Hodges, one of the 4 police who testified today, said that most of the officers used the term terrorists. They talked about domestic terrorists. Officer Hodges held up the U.S. code to back it up. So they were making a distinction between somebody who interferes in a hearing and what these folks were doing.
Yeah, this is a really interesting legal distinction because there's not really a law that makes it illegal to commit an act of domestic terrorism. What there is, and that surprises a lot of Americans, what there is on the back end, you can say that you can get a terrorism enhancement and we can classify something as an act of terrorism. But broadly speaking, there's not just one law that says this makes an act of terrorism, domestic terrorism, illegal. There are individual statutes that apply to specific instances, but, notably, gunning down people in a mob isn't one of them. So that's not something that would normally be classified as a domestic terrorism incident. If you look at, Dylan Roof's charges years back, that wasn't classified as domestic terrorism. So, under the legal definition, I think Officer Hodges is right that this meets the definition. That is something that federal prosecutors have been saying in court, and they said that this meets the legal definition. And the DOJ has referenced domestic terrorism statutes and calls this a domestic terrorism investigation. And there are many domestic terrorism prosecutors who typically handle domestic terrorism cases assigned to it, and they're handling it as a domestic terrorism instance, but they're going to be careful when they deploy that charge, because that's obviously a very politically loaded charge that you want to be careful about deploying, make sure you're always deploying it properly. But there really is no other way to describe what happened on January 6th. So what they were trying to do was influence the government, and this was a violent act to influence the government's actions. So it's really hard to, get away from that definition when that's basically by the books what it is.